Thank you, Jack, and thank you for your patience in how long it's taken for us to actually do this. And what I want to talk about, not for too long, is the issue of language policing and where the impulse comes from, and why I think that we have fallen into engaging in too much of it these days. And it's a difficult issue because the idea that we're supposed to pay very special attention to what words and phrases we use in describing the world around us comes from what begins as a very constructive and reasonable impulse. And so, for example, to say chairperson rather than chairman or chairwoman, or to try to always say actor instead of talking as if there's some separate class of actresses or heroines as opposed to heroes. I think most people would agree that our tendency to police, so to speak, that aspect of things is a good thing. The idea that there are different essences of being male and female within the same capacity and that we should use different words. That was something that deserved to be battled against. It was something I was exposed to myself in the early 90s, and I don't remember feeling any kind of resistance. Language does have to change. But the problem is that reasonable missions have a way of creeping. What begins as concrete often ends up becoming abstract. And I think that's what we've seen a lot of, especially over the past few years. It's not that all of this starts in 1991 or even 1971, but I think that especially in light of the events of 2020, other than the pandemic, we have seen a new impulse to portray it as a kind of enlightenment to feel uncomfortable about saying just about every 10th thing we might want to say. The idea is that there's supposed to be a revolution in how we express ourselves that perhaps no human beings in the 300,000 year history of our species have ever imagined forcing themselves to undergo. And the question is whether it's reasonable. And by reasonable, what I really mean is useful. Does it help anyone? Is there a purpose for it other than ones that are perhaps more about the self than the society? And what I mean is extensions of the idea that we use language in non-sexist ways into something different, which is an impulse to see slurs in as many ways of expression as we can. So it's one thing if a woman doesn't want to be referred to as an actress as opposed to an actor. I think a critical mass of thinking people will agree that society does advance, if slowly, and that this is a reasonable change in language. But what we're being asked to do is something different. And so I'm just going to take one of many examples. If it was just one example, it wouldn't be worth talking about. But there is a general tendency these days. We see lists. It tends to come from well-intentioned progressive institutions, but we see these lists. And so, for example, at Brandeis, the Prevention Advocacy Resource Center, a little while ago, proposed a list of terms that we shouldn't use. And so now we're supposed to go beyond chairperson and actor and hero and Ms. and other things like this that I don't think occasion controversy and I would hope wouldn't. It's got to be more than that. And so, for example, this Brandeis list suggested that it is against the imperatives of social justice to use a term such as walk-in. You shouldn't talk about walk-in service because a person who unfortunately is not able to walk for one reason or another might feel offended or singled out by the use of that word. You should not use the word survivor if someone has had something bad happen to them. You don't want to use the word survivor because that implies that whatever this person experienced is now over when there still may be repercussions that they're feeling. So you don't call someone a survivor, you say that someone has experienced something. Someone is not a survivor of cancer, they've experienced something. Someone is not the survivor of an earthquake, they are the experiencer of an earthquake. I'm not picking the more colorful ones. I'm actually picking rather randomly from the list, and all of this was meant quite seriously. These are words that you're not supposed to say. The list suggested that we reconsider saying African American. And the reason is because if you call someone African American, you're implying that they're hyphenated and therefore othering them. So the term African American is to be suspect. As you can imagine, this list was quite copious, and it's not just Brandeis. There are many lists like this, and the people who are proposing these lists are proposing them with the best of intentions. But the question is, where does this sort of thing actually take us? Is it worth it? Does it actually conform to what linguistic science says about how people speak and how people process language? And then more to the point, does it help anyone? And these are questions that have to be asked. And the point is not just to laugh at people making lists, but to examine whether these good faith efforts are worth, I hate to say it, but paying attention to. And so, for example, one thing that a lot of these lists that urge us to revise our terminology tend to neglect is what Steven Pinker, the psychologist at Harvard, has called the euphemism treadmill. The euphemism treadmill refers to the fact that if there is a term that has attracted negative associations, if there's a term that now is used more as a slur or in dismissal than as something neutral, then one might think that the solution is to change people's perspective on whatever that thing or group of people is by using a different word. But the problem is that in about a generation, whatever the associations were with that original term end up settling upon the new term anyway. Now, that is not fun. It's unfortunate, but it's true. It's really hard when something is unpleasant, but it's also true. And you can see this again and again and again. And so you could see crippled on buildings not too terribly long ago. That's unthinkable to us now. Crippled was changed to handicapped because of unpleasant, unfortunately, associations with people who were handicapped, except I'm dating myself and saying handicapped now because the term after this, when that term wore out, was disabled. Disabled is now wearing out, and there are other ways that we refer to the same kinds of people. It will go on and on and on. That's the way language works in a society. Another example, one that we might not think about as consciously. When I was young, which is now no longer the case, but when I was young, I had a mother, as most people do. And I think it would surprise many people to know that my mother was a social worker, hard left social worker who did not like white people very much, frankly. That was my mother. And that person, even that person in the 70s and into the 80s, if we ran into someone on the street who was asking for money, that person was called a bum. That's what my mother called that person. All of her peers called that person a bum. We would never call that person a bum now. We call that a homeless person. However, to take you back, homeless is on that Brandeis list. Homeless is now a word that we're being told we should revise, not only by Brandeis. The idea is that we might say a person who lacks housing or the like. Now, it's one thing to live in our own time and to think, okay, we need to revise that one term. But the broader picture is that there were tramps, then there were bums, then there were homeless people, and now we're going to have a new term, which, if we use a little imagination, go forward about 25 years, if we start saying person without housing, that we're going to start saying very quickly, oh, without housing person, and that's going to take on the same associations, and then we're going to have to change it again. That's how these things work. The euphemism treadmill is just there. And so it's one thing, we all live within the present, but it's one thing to say we're going to change the term in order to encourage a new kind of thought. But in many cases like this, the negative associations are going to settle down upon the new term. Now, that's not the case in something like saying chairperson instead of chairwoman. Whatever the negative associations were, with chairwoman are not going to settle onto chairperson. Chairperson is a true, clean, neutral term. But when it comes to these one-to-one replacements, there's always the fact that the gnats that settled on the first term are just going to follow to the next one. And so whenever you hear these impulses to change terminology in this way, that's something that must be kept in mind, that things aren't always going to be the way they are now. And the sad truth is that constructively, one might be more interested in trying to change thought rather than changing words. There's a certain relationship. However, it is small, it's thin, it's slippery, and it's temporary. In terms of changing how people perceive, one must argue, one must learn rhetoric, one must get out there. Changing the names of things in comparison is not only trivial, but it almost never really serves any purpose. That's one thing. Another problem with this idea that we must look for things that might offend people is that a lot of the offense is predicated upon a sense of language that neglects something very basic about how we use this big collection of words in our heads. Linguists call it polysemy. That's Polysemy, polysemy. That's many meanings. It is not just unusual, it's not just a one-off, but it is the norm that a word that we use doesn't only have that number one definition that we have it in the dictionary. And so, for example, back. If I say, what's back? The first thing you think of is the body part, okay? But if I give something back to you, it has nothing to do with your back, if you think about it, and you probably use that back more often than talking about your own back or anyone else's. You're going to give it back. Let's go back. Now you can see with go back, if you put it in between the body part and giving it back, that back has come to have something to do with returning things. And so there's this gradual process where the original word, which refers to that part in back of you, is abstractified into meaning a whole bunch of different things. Okay, that's how words work. But that means that imagine someone saying, I don't wish to be reminded of my back for some reason. And so don't talk about giving a present back or going back to the 7-Eleven. That wouldn't quite work because we think back is many things. Another example is the head. We all know what the head is. This is my head. Now, here's something that we probably say more than we say when we're talking about the head. We headed up the coast. That's something people say a lot in this state, for example. We headed up the coast. What does that have to do with your head? Nothing really. It's a different word. It did come from head. If you say you're going to head out from a party, it's not your head. When we say head, even if we have a vague sense of there being a core meaning, we mean a great many things. That's just the way language is. We make the most of a little. And so that brings us to, for example, at the University of Southern California. A lot happens at that school, I'm noticing. A lot of the stories come from USC. University of Southern California in the School of Social Work. There has been a suggestion that social workers don't talk about the field. You don't go out into the field, you don't do field work. I had a mother. She was a social worker. I grew up listening to that Black woman talking about field work all the time. If anything, it was a rather warm word. It had to do with her professionalism. It had to do with her thinking that being out in the field was doing well in the world. At USC, the idea is that the word field shouldn't be used in that way. And by extension, in general, with areas of study, that it's not a good idea because some Black people might be reminded of plantation fields. That's the rationale. Now, if that were the case, then we would be talking about something that makes civic and civil sense, just like not saying actress or heroine. But the question is that true? When somebody uses the word field to refer to social work and being out in the field, does that really mean the same thing as a field with poppies in it? Or a field where people were forced to work without wages? in a tragedy that happened in what is blissfully the past. Is that what anybody's thinking? Well, no, or at least it hasn't been proven, and I doubt if anybody would feel that it would be useful to do an experiment to see if it was. There's too much polysemy. A field can be many things. Field is used in physics to mean something quite different. The idea that a word only means one thing is based on a rather hasty conception of how we handle our words, and the energy devoted to looking for a source of offense like that, thinking that it's maybe considerate not to use that word, might be better spent doing the sorts of things that one does out in the field to try to make the world a better place. Polysemy is important, and a lot of our language policing tends to ignore it. Any linguist thinks of it. Whenever one of these prescriptions comes down, what we often murmur among one another is, but what about the polysemy? Well, what about it? So that is a major issue here. Another thing is that, frankly, a lot of the prescriptions are not especially logical. And so, for example, slave. The new idea, I think it's enforced actually by the New York Times. It is, yeah, is that you don't say slave, you should say enslaved person. Now, I completely understand the impulse there. Slave. A person might suppose that slaves were inherently slaves, that it was inherent to their condition. Many people would mention that thinkers such as Aristotle very casually thought that. Aristotle was a while ago, but still, it's something that one might consider. So instead you say enslaved person, because that makes it clearer that the slavery was something imposed upon that person rather than an inherent quality of theirs. Okay, now pull the camera out. Bum, okay, that won't do. Homeless person, because that implies that the condition is something imposed upon them. It comes from the outside. It's not that they are a bum, it's that they are a person who is burdened with the condition of homelessness. So I'm not doing a PowerPoint because I think that gets overdone these days, but if I had one, I would give you one slide. So bum, homeless person, slave, enslaved person. Why is this wrong and this is okay? So enslaved person is now considered the height of progressive wisdom when you're correcting somebody. But homeless person has to go because it's kind of a slur. The larger lesson is that if homeless person got old that quickly, what's going to happen to enslaved person? In 20 years, enslaved person is going to have the same associations. And so maybe the more important job is teaching that slavery was imposed upon people. And let's face it, that's not the hardest lesson to teach. It's rather obvious, and to the extent that there are people who are going to miss it, we could explain it. Instead, having this business of telling people that they have committed some sort of linguistic felony to say slave, especially around young people, just doesn't serve any purpose, because enslaved person isn't going to last. And by that, I don't mean that I don't think it's going to last. I know it won't. In a generation, enslaved person will be just the same thing that happened to homeless person during my lifetime. These things need to be thought about. There's an illogic to a lot of the sorts of things that we're being told we're supposed to do. There's more. I'm reading a book. I read them. And it's about political science. And the reason I'm pausing here is because I'm trying to get the title. And I don't ever say And the title is the author is Timothy Schenck, The Realigners. It's this wonderful book. It's about how people create coalitions and change history gradually. So what do you do to actually create change? There are people who hate each other and have completely incommensurate aims. But if you're going to win elections and get bills passed and get things done, then you have to be a realigner. And there have been various people in our history who have been this kind of realigner, bringing people together and doing the hard work. Believe it or not, one of those people was Martin Van Buren. You know, this non-entity of a president. Actually, he was more interesting than I thought. And part of it is that he drew together the slaveocracy of the South with a certain kind of flinty northern, what was at the time called a Republican, a Democrat Republican. Now it will be the Democrats, that party genealogy. And he brought them together and won about 1.5 elections, the idea being to create an America better than the presumably monarchical Federalist division. He brought people together. There are various people who have done it or tried. Barack Obama was trying to do that. But politics is hard. Creating change is difficult. It's work. We read about the work. We read about how hard civil rights workers worked. It's one thing to watch Martin Luther King give a stirring speech. That was 1/100th of what that man did. He worked. He was out on the ground. He was talking to recalcitrant legislators. He was out working. And I don't mean being in jail and getting physically hurt. That's horrible. But even if that doesn't happen, creating change, civil rights, progressivism, fighting for the poor, it's work. And it's easier to believe that change never happens than to allow that it happens slowly. It's slow. It's not fun. You know what's fun? Making lists of words and jumping on people for using them. It's a little easy. It's easy partly because of our technology. We have social media. If you made a list 30 years ago, you would hang it on a door and there you go. Maybe it would get published in a newspaper letter column or something like that. Now you can put it right out there. And so it ends up being, frankly, a kind of politics that is suspiciously easy to do. Real change involves getting out on the ground and engaging in grassroots activism and making a case and knowing that everything isn't going to happen instantly. That's what our forebears knew. And we're beginning to lose that. And talk about pulling the camera back. This is crucial. Pull the camera back and go back in time. It's always a useful exercise. And you have to remember, it's one of the hardest things about going back in time, as if I have, is that the pictures of these people are in black and white. And so it looks like they aren't real. So make it in color. Go back and you're at a party with Martin Luther King and Lorraine Hansberry and Bayard Rustin and Roy Wilkins. You're at a party with all those people and they're not in black and white pictures and they're moving. You can smell the room. These are real people. Imagine telling them, you all are doing important stuff, but you would be doing better if you also policed language more. You should be more concerned with what things are called. You should be more concerned with phraseologies, and you should be reading the Riot Act to people who use the wrong word. All of you would be better off if you did that. Imagine saying that to A. Philip Randolph. Imagine having a conversation like that with Pauli Murray. Imagine talking to W.E.B. Du Bois, and you're at dinner with him. You're at Chez Panisse with him, and he's in color, and he's moving. And you say, well, Dr. Du Bois, have you thought about policing terminology because you would be doing a better job? Notice how absurd that is? What would they have gained from what is now becoming so popular and seen as some form of social justice? Because make no mistake, the people who are doing this are not ridiculous. I'm not saying that they're ridiculous. They think that they're doing a kind of good. They think that this is part of social justice to forge different ways of thinking through teaching people not to say things. You can get where they're coming from, but the question is, does it work? Is it plausible? And one way of examining that question is, should people have been doing it in the past? And to the extent that you can imagine, Lorraine Hansberry, she was a person of words. She was very concerned with forging change, even forging change in the abstract way of writing plays and writing articles as opposed to marching in the street, although she did that too. Imagine her, not in black and white, but in color, smoking her cigarette. And you say, Lorraine, okay, yeah, congratulations on Raisin in the Sun. I want to bring something up with you. You can imagine the look on her face. If you've seen more than a few photos of her, you can imagine what she would say. She was right. What we're doing now is an unfortunate detour from what creating real change is. And we need to think about it. It's like in Alice in Wonderland, the Cheshire Cat. The Cheshire Cat fades and just leaves the smile. The Cheshire Cat is activism. The idea that you tell people not to say walk-in or homeless person and that's social justice, that's just leaving the smile, including that it feels suspiciously good to police language for something that's actually supposed to be hard work. Hard work almost never feels that good. So that's another problem with this whole way of looking at things. And I'm going to go somewhere because I think it's partly my responsibility. Yes, the N-word. We've got a problem with that. And so, for example, we're being told in many quarters, and if this room is those quarters to any extent, I'm sorry about the word that I'm about to say. It's not that word, it's Negro. We're being told that the word Negro is a slur. Teachers all over the country are being read the Riot Act, hauled up before judicial boards for using the word Negro. Now, of course, almost never is anybody calling someone Negro. It's an antique term at this point. I don't know if it's an insult. I know an older Black gentleman who always calls me Negro and he means it affectionately, but we won't go there. That's subtle. Negro is an ancient term, and okay, now African American is the term of art. Great. But if somebody is reading from something that, say, Martin Luther King wrote, and he used the word Negro all the time, is that teacher really supposed to euphemize the word Negro because it's a slur? Who said? What this is this idea that it is social justice to seek something being classified as a slur. And the question is, where does that get us? What is the purpose of it having been decided about 7 years ago by certain people under 30, frankly, that Negro is a slur? What's the point? Who does it feed? What housing does it build on what side of the city? What's the point? There's an idleness about it. And I'm not going to say the word, but that other word. This new idea that to refer to the N-word is the same thing as using it is absurd. It is utterly absurd. And the reason that I'm putting it that way is because I'm old enough now to remember when, within reason, you could use the N-word because everybody knew that you weren't actually using it. You were referring to it. And you know, uncannily, I remember that being the case in what was probably this room when this floor was laid out differently at a conference in what would have been the spring of 1996. It was an African American Studies conference. It was a conference that was kicking off the first year that African American Studies was a graduate program. And I have a vivid memory of that word being used, and not in a jolly way, not in a colorful way. It wasn't being read from Zora Neale Hurston. It wasn't only Black people. It wasn't Black men calling each other buddy. People needed to use the word. Many of them were white, and within reason, you could. I frankly think it's ridiculous that I can't say it here, but I live in 2023, and so I, as a Black man, cannot say it. Okay, I have bigger fish to fry. But that was not the case in 1996. In this city, downtown, somewhere on Shattuck, I remember doing one of my first radio interviews where somebody asked the new young linguist what the history of that word was. I've still got it on cassette. It's one of my early interviews. And no, I don't sit around listening to it. But I remember very well that I and the white host and the other person who was on the show, who was also white, probably said the word about 7 times, and nobody batted an eye because we weren't using it. We were referring to it. Now we don't do that. And frankly, I don't think it makes any sense. I don't think it serves any purpose. And the reason I say that so arrogantly is because life wasn't that different in 1996. Everybody understood the difference. There was the occasional person who would push it too far, and they would be ostracized. They would be condemned, sure. But that kind of person was very rare. Evil is very rare. And yet we have a situation now where we're encouraged to treat that word as if it were a magic word. The idea is that you can't utter it at all. It's as if we're a very different and frankly less reflective culture where now we can't read Huckleberry Finn. I don't know how many times people have asked me, what do I do about this book? How do I read it to my child? A white person asks. And I can guarantee you that Black parents are just reading the book. But if you're not Black, then you have to have Jim saying slave, which is not what he's saying, or you don't read the book at all. And so Huck Finn becomes contraband. The problem with this is this. Already, the illiberalism that we're seeing from both sides, there is the right wing book banning and an aspect of the right wing that is basically saying, don't stir all of that stuff up and don't teach it to kids. Then on the left, you have the prosecutorial wing of the woke, who are basically throwing people out of windows for being offensive. All of that is primitive. All of it sounds either medieval or it sounds like yellow journalism in, say, 1895. It sounds like people in Congress beating each other up. It's primitive. And notice, I'm saying this is from both sides. We're regressing. It's also regressive for us to create a magic word in a way that a smart 9-year-old can't even understand. And we've only created this over the past 20 or 30 years. And to what end? To what purpose? No one was offended in 1995 when somebody referred to the word, but now we pretend to be. We're pretending. We're taught to pretend. And my we here is mostly Black, but I think it also extends to fellow travelers. It's fake. It's a pretense, and we all know it. It's primitive. And you know, some things are just going to stay the way they are. But that policing of language is another example of something that doesn't make any sense, doesn't serve any purpose. And frankly, it builds no lower middle class or upper working class housing in previously suburban zone districts. It creates nothing like social justice. It's just posturing. That's what language policing can lead to. So what I'm referring to overall is the simple fact that pursuing social justice is very important. It ought to be a central focus of anyone who is a concerned citizen. All these things are extremely important. But there's a mission creep where we call ourselves forging social justice, where what we're really doing is something that's focused on making ourselves look good to other people. It's like showing faith within a religious body. And there is such a slip between the intention, i.e. social justice, and the actual result that I really do think that we have a problem. Activism is going out and actively doing something. Our new tacit idea is this. Activism is finding ways of being offended, either for yourself or on behalf of other people. Activism is finding ways of being offended. I think many people would say that that is activism, but the question is, who does it help? Interesting historical parallel, depending on what you call history. About 15 years ago, a book got around. It was called Stuff White People Like. It was hilarious, and it skewered, I hate to say it, but I remember at the time thinking it's a lot of people in Berkeley. It's a lot of people in New York and places like Park Slope and the Upper West Side. It's white people who I know, and it's me to an extent. And it satirized, the tastes in food, the TV shows, what you like to wear. There were about 100 things. And one of the things that it nailed right on the head, I think the book was 04 or 05, was being offended. That this white person likes to be offended. And that was right on, because that person did wear t-shirts, espousing certain causes. And there was a certain theatrical quality to the being offended, but it was better than nothing. It was a harmless little jibe. What's interesting is that today, that joke wouldn't land, because the very same people are so committed to being offended that they would find it insulting to have it mocked in that way. It's not funny anymore. And I actually read an interview with the guy who wrote it, and he said, the book is obsolete based on that. That's a big social change. And frankly, what was the joke then is kind of a joke now. Being offended as sport. The reason that it's wrong is not only because it's fake. Fake is wrong, but it's not a moral tort, but because it doesn't really help anybody. Being offended alone is not activism. Activism is getting out there and doing hard, slow, boring work. The language policing culture that we're dealing with now is a symptom of our having moved away from that. And what worries me about it is not just that it doesn't look good and it doesn't taste good, but that I feel that a whole generation of people are losing a sense of what it is to go out into the world and try to change it, and are missing that going out into the world and trying to change it is not going to be about warmth. It's not going to be about group fellowship. You're not going to feel like a happy warrior. It's not going to be fun. It's not that kind of thing. I worry that we're going to lose that at a time when we're losing so much else. And so our language policing culture at this time worries me. And I would have to say, it's not really about me being a linguist. I think that, whatever the worth is of anything that I've said, anybody who's halfway awake could see things in the exact same way. This isn't me being linguist. This is me being moonlighting, cultural commentator, editorialist. But I really do worry that action has become empty gesture, and that there's a whole cadre of people who feel and are being taught by people who ought to know better that they're on the side of the angels and creating something called social justice, when frankly, they're not. I'm going to stop here. Thank you.